I would also argue that they're wrong about freedom and responsibility.
Greetings and welcome there, people of YouTube. This is Essence of Water, continuing with my dismantling of Peter S. Williams' lecture given at the University of Surrey. We're continuing on from where we left off, so let's get stuck in.
I think if I were someone who's convinced of a naturalistic worldview, I would find this argument very convincing. It goes like this. First premise, purely physical things, or systems, you might want to add, but purely physical things, behave according to the laws of physics. And they lack libertarian free will. Now, even if you want to include an element of genuine ontological randomness within the laws of physics, behaving randomly is not the same thing as behaving intentionally with free will. So purely physical things behave according to the laws of physics, and so they lack libertarian free will.
I fully agree with you. I just wish that YouTube theist inspiring philosophy would also accept the fact that randomness does not equate free will, and it is merely a quantum dice for the D&D game of reality.
Second premise, human beings are purely physical things. From those two premises, it follows deductively that therefore human beings lack libertarian free will. Now, I disagree with this argument, but that's because I think that human beings are not purely physical things, which is a belief that entails that naturalism is false. But hey, I'm not a naturalist, I'm a supernaturalist because I'm a Christian. But if I started from the same worldview position that naturalism is true, I think I would find this a very powerful argument. You can see this argument underlying what Richard Dawkins says, for example, when he talks about applying his worldview to the judicial system. Here's a quote from the Edge Foundation website. Dawkins argues that human brains, though they may not work in the same way as man-made computers, are surely governed by the laws of physics. And of course, from his naturalistic perspective, there isn't a difference between a human brain and a human mind. He is not a mind-body dualist. He says, when a computer malfunctions, we don't punish it, we track down the problem and we fix it. Isn't the murderer just a machine with a defective component? He says, concepts like blame and responsibility are bandied about freely where human wrongdoers are concerned, but doesn't a mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility? So he concludes that any crime, he says, is in principle to be blamed not on the person who commits the crime, is to be blamed on antecedent conditions acting through the accused's physiology, heredity, and environment, and the interaction thereof.
So, if what Dawkins had said was true, in a society which we view as becoming more and more rational, with the growth of the non-religious in that society, we would expect to see a number of different things. On one hand, we would expect the attempted abolishment of retributive punishment, and by this I mean punishment merely carried out in revenge, i.e. he hurt me, so I hurt him to fulfill some perverse sense of justice. This may be best seen in Numbers chapter 15 with the story of the Sabbath breaker being put to death, i.e. while the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody, because it was not clear what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp." So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord commanded Moses. So the punishment wasn't done or carried out to repair the damages or the man who caused the damages. It was merely a case of, you blasphemed against God, therefore you die. In a rational society, however, we would expect to see put in its place institutions that seek to isolate sources of social issues and if at all possible, attempt to repair them. Welcome to the developing justice system, Mr. Williams, and the 21st century. The arm of the law is not there to carry out your revenge, but actually to stop your emotions blinding your actions. The law is there to try and fix problems, to resolve them, and if at all possible, salvage those imprisoned. Sadly, the system is flawed due to a number of individuals not sharing in this realistic view of the issue and instead demanding that the law comes down hard and angry, which time and time again has been shown to fail in reducing both the offending and the re-offending rates of crime. As for environmental factors, why not turn to the Perry Preschool Project, which was a longitudinal study that found for every dollar placed in a child at a young enough age could end up saving the state $16 in the future, as it decreased crime rates and increased employment rates with those involved. I believe a drastic reform of the system is required. Prisons need to be a second society with higher levels of observation and management to attempt to re-socialize as many individuals as possible whilst ensuring the human rights of those too dangerous to be put back into wider society.
But here's the question I would want to put to this, particularly given the New Atheist stance against the evils of religion, which is primarily grounded in their stance that religion is all about having blind faith, and blind faith leads to you being gullible and strapping on bombs to yourself and flying planes into buildings and things because you're not exercising your critical faculties like you should. Well, if everything about a person is, quote, governed by the laws of physics, surely blaming them for their intellectual failings, I don't know, a failing such as having blind faith, wouldn't that make about as much sense as Newton blaming gravity for giving him an apple-sized bump on the head? So how could anyone, for example, a Christian, be responsible for not living up to their intellectual responsibilities if they aren't free to be responsible for anything in the first place? Now, it seems to me that the obvious answer to that question is they can't. Dawkins can't have it both ways. You can either berate religious folks for not living up to their responsibilities, or you can tell people that they don't have any responsibilities, but telling them both things at the same time doesn't seem to make much sense.
Here is the issue. You are presenting such a complex and multi-layered topic as rather simple. Morals, values, and social norms are in no way genetic. They are the software of the mind and thus can be challenged and changed to better an individual's functioning. You cannot equate these to the laws of physics, as regardless of your efforts, physics will not change. However, if you had a severe mental disability that rendered you unable to empathize with people and as a result you caused some harm, do we not typically make allowances on clearly visible genetic factors? Surely, if we all had libertarian free will, then the special allowances and understandings we have for the mentally disabled who lack certain impulse blockers should not exist. We should not be compassionate towards them for what in your eyes is clearly their choice in action. Do you see now what happens when you attempt to blur the lines of distinction your opponent set up in their own argument? I can make you come out looking like an anti-mentally disabled bigot by doing to you what you are attempting to do to Dawkins, and that's really not fair. I don't think you have a personal vendetta against the mentally disabled. I merely think that you have not thought very long and hard about the implications of your own argument and what it leads to. As for blame, isn't blame merely the way of getting someone to accept the fact that they caused something to happen and that something is wrong? Therefore, wouldn't blame be the first step required in addressing the situation, to fixing the problem once it is located? As Dawkins put it in his article, mental constructs like blame and responsibility, indeed evil and good, are built into our brains by a millennia of Darwinian evolution. Dawkins, however, then goes on to suggest that maybe we will learn to outgrow this prospect with our better understanding of the human mind. I personally disagree on the basis that I believe romanticization of these concepts is what makes us human, but I can still see what Dawkins means.
Which ties in pretty closely, as you can see, to the whole subject of morality. Now, again, here the new atheists don't speak necessarily with one voice. Sam Harris, again, interestingly, stands out as a moral objectivist. I've read his book on moral objectivism. I don't think he does a good job of defending it in terms of his worldview, but I would agree with him about the objectivity of moral values. But most new atheists are moral subjectivists. They don't believe there really are such things as moral values or obligations in reality. So, despite their constant moralising, whether you take Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great or Dawkins' The God Delusion, their scientism, which sets up, as we saw earlier, this fact-value distinction, leads them to reject the objective reality of moral values. So, for example, Dawkins says this. He says there is a non-overlapping and exhaustive distinction between ideas that are false or true about the real world, factual matters in the broad sense, and ideas about what we ought to do, normative or moral ideas, for which the words true and false have no meaning. Okay? So, when he says in his book things like Hitler and Stalin were by any standards spectacularly evil men, you might be tempted to think that Richard Dawkins thinks that Hitler and Stalin were by any standards spectacularly evil men. But you will have to remember that as he talks to you in your other ear, as it were, that he's also telling you that I don't believe that there are any objective values. There aren't any standards in that sense. Any standards are just socio-biological relative things. He talks about the changing zeitgeist and so on. But then surely that undermines equally claims like faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. Setting aside the fact that he's misunderstood faith there, seems that again he's sort of trying to give you a viewpoint with one hand that he's also taking away with the other. He seems to be saying on the one hand that we have an objective moral obligation to oppose religion because religion is an objectively bad thing, in that it does encourage people to ignore their genuine intellectual moral obligations. But he also says that there are no objective moral values to which we could be obligated. Quite apart from the fact that we couldn't actually have the freedom to follow those obligations in the first place.
This is just one huge knotted mess, and it took me a lot of digging to figure out what was going on. The observant may have noticed the change in referencing number between the first quote and the following two quotes. This was due to a change in source from Dawkins' role in the Afterword of Brockman's What is Your Dangerous Idea to Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. What is Your Dangerous Idea was an edited book consisting of 108 essays written on various topics to do with the title question. Dawkins noted in the Afterword how the majority of these articles kept to the factual aspects of the argument and the rest took the normative aspects. However, what may also be of interest is then he goes on to offer two topics that could have been discussed in either way. His exact words were, I have two suggestions, both of which can be spun into either the is or the ought box. I'd also like to point out the usage of standards, i.e. the plural of standard, referencing the fact that there's more than a singular objective standard set to the universe. Beyond that, I think his words were merely hyperbole. I doubt a neo-Nazi or modern-day Stalinist would agree with him. See, values are subjective, and this is a testable hypothesis, as I just noted. Compare any subculture, or in fact any nation geographically or historically, and you will see this. Open your eyes to the way things exist, not the way you wish them to be. Also, Dawkins is not the simpleton you would act to paint him as, but rather an individual capable of discussing two fronts simultaneously, i.e. both the is and the ought. This may be best seen in the following quote on faith and how it is evil. Remember that he personally subscribes to the humanist philosophy, and that many of his readers would also join him in the idea that human harm is a problem of society. Is it then of little surprise that when discussing his reasons for despising faith, that he falls back on the values in finding cases of how religious faith has caused great harm to humanity? While facts on reality cannot instill the values required to give you reason to ought, if you already have those values, then I can reason with you precisely for that reason. Thanks to our biological empathy and our social predisposition, the likelihood of a person viewing harm of another person as wrong is very high, and this is the factor that Dawkins is banking on. Dawkins is under no delusion that he is able to convince the likes of those who lack the biological capability for empathy or has a deep-rooted enjoyment of human suffering. Yet these are biological anomalies, and thus the scope for his impact is very large in what he says. Just as science aims for a low p-value to be more certain of what they see, Dawkins aims for the wider society and their shared values to have a greater impact in what he says. To quote Stephen Weinberg, all logical arguments can be defeated by the simple refusal to reason logically. Fact is, the majority of us do reason logically on many aspects of life. It's just that for this one particular aspect, that of a divine designer, we have culturally elected to allow some mythical protection from external criticism, whether it be an is criticism or an ought criticism. We're here to drag that belief kicking and screaming into the real world for the harm that it has caused. Our will is fully determined by our social and biological makeup. That is correct. However, a deterministic will does not equal no will at all, as you mockingly seem to claim. All it means is that our will is deep-rooted in the position we hold, and it's this will that drives us to work to a better society for the survival of us, our families, and our species. In closing, I would also like to point out this. Even if you were capable of pointing out flaws in our knowledge or various gaps, it would in no way conclude God. This is just like all the gaps of knowledge in the past that we have had God jammed into them, only later to find out otherwise. I would also like to know how you think the existence of a God, which is a purely ontological premise, leads to a moral ought. If it's merely a case of God says and therefore it's so, then how do you differentiate God from any other being with a consciousness, whether it be of a higher tier like the devil or lower tier like man? How do we judge the standards of God and the devil? Do we use God's own standards? Sound familiar? You see, the argument that you cannot judge other people's moral standards by your own standards is equally applicable to God and the devil. How can you judge their standards without falling back on the standards of your own God? The issue exists there in equal force as it exists down here with us. So you do not escape the issue, you merely add an unnecessary step. So yes, this is the end of this segment of the series. I hope you guys have enjoyed. It's certainly been a pleasure. This is Essence of Thought. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, as well as share. I hope you have enjoyed. Take care and out.